All right, whole Bible readers, it is week 44. We are getting on with it. It seems like there's a long way to go, but it's actually much, much less than what we've already read. Now, this week we are going to continue with 1 Corinthians. We got just barely started on it at the beginning of, or at the end of last week, and now we're going to finish that letter this week. Now, the Corinthian church that Paul is writing to in this letter has just a massive list of problems. As we go through the book, we see they're divided into factions according to who their favorite Christian leader is. There's a problem with immorality in the church. There is a man who is shacking up with his father's wife, with his stepmother. And Paul says, look, even the pagans don't do that. They're taking each other to court with lawsuits. They have disputes about the proper place of sex and marriage in the life of a Christian. They have disputes about whether they should eat meat that has previously been sacrificed to idols. Some say, sure, it's fine. Others say, no, that's terrible. And they're arguing about that. They have disputes about propriety in worship, what's proper for people to do, and about sharing in worship. Their Lord's Supper observances all torn up because instead of sharing food in a common meal, people are hoarding it for themselves while others go hungry. And then they're arguing over spiritual gifts of all things, over who has the better gift. And they have misunderstanding and dispute about the resurrection of the dead. Apparently, some people are saying, why should God bother with this shabby physical body that we live in this shabby world? Shouldn't He just take us to a place of pure spirit? Wouldn't that be better? Well, you're going to see how Paul addresses each of these, but there's an overarching theme to the whole letter that is articulated again and again. We overcome these problems not just by addressing them specifically, but by, first of all, exercising the mind of Christ. Paul says you have the mind of Christ, and that's completely different from the mind of the world. And that's illustrated in the story of Jesus that Paul's alluding to, because Christ doesn't act on His own behalf. He gives Himself for the sake of others. You have the power of the Holy Spirit. The Spirit enables you to overcome the habits and patterns of the old life, the ways of the flesh, as Paul calls it in other letters like Romans that we've just read. Through the Spirit, you are empowered to a new kind of life. And by the mind of Christ and the power of the Spirit, you are enabled to live God's kind of love. Probably the most famous chapter in this letter is 1 Corinthians 13. And Paul didn't write that just thinking, I need a good chapter for people to read at weddings. I think I'll drop it right into the middle of this letter. No, it comes in the midst of all of this discussion, and in fact, right in the middle of the discussion of spiritual gifts, as a way of saying, you could be the greatest Christian ever, and if you don't love others, you are terrible. You have missed the whole point. All of this is grounded in the gospel, which culminates in Jesus' resurrection from the dead. And so we are on this trajectory where Paul can say, be steadfast, immovable, knowing that, abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain. Why is that? Well, all of this giving of yourself, all of this loving people, all of this caring about other people's stuff more than you care about your own stuff, that's at the essence of addressing every one of these problems in 1 Corinthians, well, we have the assurance that all of that stuff is worthwhile because God is going to raise His people from the dead and renew the earth, and we will live together in harmony in the fullness of that love and in the presence of Christ. And that means every one of these things is going to add up to something and is going to matter for something for eternity that we will celebrate and we will look back on and we will see as God's victory, which we are enjoying at that point. Now, very interesting, at the end of this letter, Paul says, hey, take up a collection because I'm coming. Well, this is a short note that will be explained more in 2 Corinthians. Paul, as an expression of the mind of Christ by the power of the Spirit to live God's kind of love, all grounded in the gospel, was taking a collection of money from the churches that he had started to take back to Jerusalem to the Jewish Christians there who had been there at the beginning of this thing and had suffered greatly as a token, as an expression of solidarity and generosity with the church, which is becoming this worldwide movement. So as you read this book, you'll see lots of trees in the forest, but see the forest ecosystem. And it's maybe summed up most briefly and specifically in 1 Corinthians 8:1. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. There it is. Happy reading in 1 Corinthians this week.